Hey, real quick, before we get into that episode, do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. That way you don't miss out on any marketing nuggets. Enjoy the show.
But that's the kind of podcast that I want. Besides being something that gives me satisfaction, it brings people to the museum. It opens doors for me. It does all kinds of things. To me, the most important tip is know what you want to get out of the podcast.
Hi, I'm Josh Owens. As the owner of a video marketing company in New Orleans, I've been on the quest to learn everything I can about marketing. Everyone has a different style, different strategy, and a different experience. Is there a wrong way to do it? A right way to do it? Let's find out together as we make marketing make sense. So welcome back, everybody, to another fantastic episode of Make Marketing Make Sense. Today I'm joined by Liz Williams, the founder of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. Gotta get my words out. And what a fantastic museum it is. So it's such a pleasure to have you in here. But you're not just the founder of this museum, you're also the host of your own podcast, Tip of the Tongue. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I think so. Well, today we're going to talk all about the power of podcasting because you've been doing your podcast since 2019. A lot of people would die to have something that consistent. So it's just amazing that you've been able to do that and keep it going and expand upon it. And, you know, to be able to tell your story about how this basically thing that came into existence is now proliferated into what it is today. So fantastic. And I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Great. I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah.
Well, first of all, back in 2019, even then podcasting was big, but people weren't doing it, especially locally. What got you inspired to start a podcast?
Well, I had been thinking about it for at least 2 years beforehand and was looking at podcasts and stuff. And the thing that I saw was you had to be ready to be consistent. So you had to have that commitment. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I dragged my feet for at least 2 years because I thought, do I want to do this over and over and over again? And so, of course, that leads you down the road of, so what do you want to have your podcast be? And now this takes you way back, but I used to like the Dick Cavett show on television. Okay. And what I liked about it is that it was kind of a long-form interview on television. Mm-hmm. So unlike some of the Tonight shows and other kinds of talk shows where you had one guest and then another guest and another guest, he would have one person on, and for half an hour, sometimes for an hour, he would interview them, and they'd have a real conversation. And I thought, that's really what I want to do. I don't want my podcast to be like a radio show where you have this and you intercede this and whatever, and it's all edited into some kind of little slick thing. I wanted it to feel like we're just talking. Yeah. So that 2 years, and I don't think it had to take 2 years because it wasn't the only thing I was thinking about, but if, it took that time to figure out what I wanted to do that I felt I could be committed to doing because I think that consistency is really, really fundamental. Yeah. And so that's how I got started.
Well, that's interesting. So how did you kind of, how did you know you were ready for that? How did you know you had that consistency ready?
Well, it was more just, I feel like this is what I want to do. And I made this long list of all the people that I would start with and who I wanted to interview and how I was going to do it. And I got the opportunity to talk to some of the people that I already knew. I interviewed Ralph Brennan, for example, when he opened a place at the New Orleans Museum of Art. And I thought, okay, so there's a restaurant in this museum. I know about museums.
Acorn, right?
I can't remember the name of it.
It's something like that.
Acorn, I think, is the one at the Children's Museum.
Oh, there's too many. We got too many museums in this city. All right. Well, and there's too many Brennans too. Right. But yeah, that's wild.
So anyway, so I was able to talk to him. And I also knew that I didn't want to have lots of equipment. I didn't want to have a lot of trouble with that. And I started looking for easier ways to edit because I was looking at these sound waves and stuff, and I'm not going to ever be able to edit that.
Because you're all on your own at this point.
That's right. I'm totally on my own. I'm still on my own. I still do all of it.
Wow. Incredible.
And so that's really how I got started. And I was able to go to a conference, and this really committed me. I went to this conference as a journalist.
Yeah.
And
and you had no journalism credit before that, right?
Not really. No,
And so,
I had written things,
right.
but I wasn't a journalist.
Yeah.
But once you say you have a podcast,
that's right.
then you're a journalist.
Yeah.
And so the PR people at the conference helped set up all these podcast interviews for me. And so I wound up leaving there with, let's say 10. I don't remember the number anymore, but say 10 interviews. Well, that was 10 weeks. And of course, I didn't want to do one after another, but I was able to talk to somebody at that time about the what looked like a coming epidemic, and I was asking about what was going on in China and how it was going to affect agriculture and all of that, and so then I had this fabulous podcast that was so timely and everything. And so that's really kind of how I got started, where it was like I realized I can do multiple interviews in a week. I can just do lots of things together, and that'll take me several weeks to go through. And so once I started learning all of that, it just became a lot easier.
Yeah. And I guess, you kind of alluded to some of these challenges, but, especially at that moment, you have this big breakout moment where you're at this conference, basically getting all these timely interviews, but now you have the job of, putting all this together. Like, what were the biggest challenges that you faced?
Editing. I had to learn how to edit. And I find it incredibly tedious. I loathe it.
Yeah.
And so I found a program that lets me edit from the written word, and that made all the difference. And
what was the program?
It's called Descript.
Oh, another Descriptor. People love Descript. It's fantastic.
And so I started using that program, even though even that was not intuitive. But I've been doing it long enough now that it's not a big deal anymore. And so I once I kind of got that down, everything started to become easier and easier. And like Descript takes all the uhs out easily. I don't have to go by
Yeah.
It just they just all come out.
Right.
Things like that.
Yeah.
Really nice.
Very fantastic. I mean, that's the power of modern technology.
That's right. That's
right. Well, too, and you already kind of alluded to this as well, what were some of the markers of success that you felt? I mean, I love that part of how you were saying about with this conference, you just say, I have a podcast, and am I a journalist now? And they're like, yeah, come on in. We'll roll out the red carpet for you.
That's right.
What were some of the other kind of success moments that you felt from this podcast that you had?
Well, I was reading the New York Times, and there was a book that seemed really fascinating, and I wanted to talk to the author. I had no idea who he was, how to contact him or anything, but I just contacted the PR department of the publisher and said, I have a podcast, and I gave him a link to some of the podcast interviews and said, I'd really like to interview this person, and I'd like you to send me a media copy of the book, and so I can read it.
You went in.
Yeah,
I
did.
I love that.
And they got right back to me.
Wow.
And they said that they had put a copy of the book in the mail to me, and that they were talking to the writer, the author of the book, and that they'd get back to me and give me some times when he would be available.
Incredible.
And then I started to use Zoom a lot. And then I realized by using Zoom, because he was in New York and I was here, so that meant there was, this is not something you're going to fly up to New York to do.
Right.
But started using Zoom. And then after I used Zoom a little bit, I started to think, well, I could write and talk to anybody. I can talk to people in Italy. I can talk to people in India. I can talk to people anywhere. I talked to someone in Kenya. I mean, it was, it just that freed me up a lot. So that and then my son keeps telling me he still wants me to do this, to do video. And he says, YouTube is the place you need to be and everything. But then I have to edit video, and I'm just not ready for that.
Yeah,
I'm not.
Well, when you have a team of people behind you, video becomes much easier.
Sure, sure, yeah.
No one sees it, but there are people behind
there
those
are
cameras,
people there. Yes, I can see them.
You can see them. I'm not going crazy. Well, yes, and I think that's amazing. I think what I loved about what you're saying too is that how flattering it is to be invited to something like a podcast,
right? Yes.
And so being able to be invited and no matter who you are, you really see the magic and the power of it, the connections you make. I don't know if have any of these connections led to any kind of business connections at all for the museum, or any, I know you mentioned to me before you've had people come in and say they've heard your podcast, but I don't know if you've had, what kind of business success you've gotten from it.
So I think I can't say that there's direct business success. I think it's indirect. But I do know that it means more people know about the museum.
Yeah.
And so people come to the museum, and literally, if I'm at the front desk and I'm talking to somebody, they'll say, I listened to your podcast.
Wow.
I recognize your voice.
Yeah, that's wild.
And I came here because I listened to your podcast.
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh, we got this huge business deal out of it or something.
Right.
But it also gives us something. For example, we've created partnerships with other organizations, and these are usually food organizations in some way or another, food or drink. And we are able to say, as a part of the partnership, we can interview X number of people for our podcast. And that often cinches the partnership.
Yeah.
So it gives us a tool.
Exactly.
So it's not necessarily an after the fact result. It's simply because we have now years of podcasting.
Yeah.
So people know that it's going to really happen.
Yeah.
It's not, I think in the beginning, the hardest thing is that people think, well, is it worth it? Because I don't know if it's going to last. And you may not have built up a very large audience yet or anything like that. But I think that my particular style of podcast, where I have one person, half an hour, and we just have a conversation, kind of like this, is that people feel like they can listen to other people's conversations in previous podcasts, and then they feel like, okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
That's just a conversation.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I mean, and one thing I want to kind of touch base on before we, go back on it is, you mentioned earlier about how your son kind of is giving you tips about you should start a video podcast. I'm sure now that you've had this podcast for so long, there's people all not just yourself, probably online seeing it, but also other people telling you, oh, you should do this, do that. What are some of the things that people have suggested to you? And what were the things that really worked? Tips for other people that want to get their podcast started. What were some of the things that really were helpful and some of the things that were not so helpful?
So, I mean, everybody has these ideas. Most of the time, the things that I felt were not helpful when people want you to change the way you're doing it, like your format. You should have 3 segments, and they should be about this and this and this. And you should do this other thing, and you should have recipes all the time. And you should, they have this idea, maybe for their podcast, it might work perfectly. But they want me to do it so they don't have to, So it can
Everyone's living vicarously through you.
That's right. Yeah. And so they want it to be the podcast they want to do, but I do it.
Right.
And so there's a lot of that. And so you just have to say, I know what I want to do, and I know what works for me. And some of it is because it works, and some of it is just my own interests. I don't want to cook and have the be somebody filming me cook something and that's the podcast. No, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be the kind of journalist podcaster who goes to somebody's kitchen and films them cooking. That's just not what I want to do.
That's a whole different
thing. That's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a great thing to do.
Yeah.
It's just that's not what I want to do.
Right.
And I think that's really the key to sticking to it. The thing that you like doing.
Yeah.
And so that's
That's awesome. And following up on that too is, if someone was going to start a podcast, what would be like, if you could give them one or two tips for starting, what would you say?
Well, from a practical standpoint or from like a planning standpoint, like to me, the most important tip you can give anybody is decide what you want to do. Why are you doing this? What are your goals for doing this? That's more important to me than anything like,
great.
Get good equipment or, something like that.
Yeah.
Because, I know this about my podcast. It is not slick. I know that it is not the kind of podcast you could ever put up for an award or anything like no, not Pulitzer, but another kind of podcast award.
Podcast of the year.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I don't know if they make that, but
but
something.
Sort of something like that. No, it's not that kind of podcast. It's really, truly not slick. But that's the kind of podcast that I want.
Right.
And so you just have to know, if your goal is to be awarded a James Beard Award for your podcast.
Yeah.
Well, then you have to do the kind of podcast that can get you a James Beard Award. I'm not trying to do that.
Yeah.
I'm just doing something that I enjoy. And so it has its own benefits besides being something that gives me satisfaction. It brings people to the museum. It opens doors for me. It does all kinds of things. And that's what I want it to do.
Yeah.
And so to me, the most important tip is know what you want to get out of the podcast.
Well, I wanted to, kind of round it out and just ask, are there any kind of big future plans for Tip of the Tongue? Or things you're trying to do that you want to tell people about as you, transition into another year of podcasting?
I'm just going to keep on doing the same sort of thing. I'm hoping all the time that, people just continue want to listen to it because it's just following my own interests. I don't have like this long-term goal. Oh, I want to have X number of listeners. I want to have the number of listeners who want to hear it, and I know myself well enough to know that I'm not going to change what I'm doing to get more listeners. And I don't post it all over the place. I don't do any of those things because I just don't want to.
Yeah.
And so all of those tips that people have about always put it on Instagram, put it on TikTok, do this, do that, whatever. I just don't. And so, and I know I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, what impresses me all the more is that you do have what seems to be a very loyal listening group anyway of people that do come to find your podcast and listen to it on a regular basis.
What surprises me all the time is that I have people, for example, who are into books, not into necessarily food books, but who say, I found books listening to you talk to authors that are people that I want to read. And then that makes them listen to my podcast more because they think, well, maybe we'll find something else like that. Because these are not food people; they're readers.
Yeah.
So I've found that to be very, very interesting, and that it's not just food people who are listening to me, even though it's always about food and drink.
That's amazing. Well, I love hearing every bit of that, and I love everything that you've told me today. I think people are going to really resonate with like sticking to your message and all the great things that you talked about. So the last thing I want to let you tell the people is where they can find your podcast, where they can find the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, in case they're curious about what it is that you've done so far.
Well, the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, now 20 years old.
Oh, yeah, 20 years. Woo!
Yes.
High five.
So We are located in New Orleans at 1504 O.C. Haley. You can read all about it at southernfood.org, and that's a good place to explore. Tip of the Tongue is available at most places where you can listen to podcasts, like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all of those places. And all you have to do is put in Tip of the Tongue, and it comes
Pops
up.
right up.
Yep.
I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for
having me. This has been
me.
another fantastic episode, and we'll see you all on the next one. Thanks for tuning into the show. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. This episode of Make Marketing Make Sense is brought to you by Comfystone. If your business needs organic social media video content, video ads, or video podcasting, hit up Comfystone at comfystone.com and follow Comfystone on Instagram and TikTok. Until next time, this is Make Marketing Make Sense.